The morning the inquiry opened, the great hall of the assize at Marchwood was so full that the windows had been thrown wide to let the heat escape, and into that crowded silence, a young woman in a plain gray gown was led to a chair set apart from her family, as though her presence required a quarantine. The rest of them did not. The room had a verdict ready before a single question had been asked. She was the quiet one, the slow one, the sister who did not speak in company, and who had been kept at the back of the house at Thornley for as long as anyone could remember. Lady Margaret Vane sat near the front in dove, silk, and pearls, the picture of a sister bearing a family embarrassment with patience, and when she leaned to whisper to the woman beside her, the whisper carried just far enough. "The poor creature," she said, "hardly knows her own name." Honora Aldous heard it. She did not turn her head. Her hands lay folded in her lap, perfectly still, and only the smallest tightening at the corner of her mouth betrayed that the words had landed somewhere and been kept. At the far end of the hall, behind the long table where the commissioners sat, a man stood near the tall window with his back half to the room, and he had not stopped watching her since she came in. He was the only person present who seemed to find nothing settled about her at all. "Stay a while, if you can." What this room had decided about Honora Aldous was about to be undone in front of every person who had decided it, and the undoing would take a long and careful afternoon. His name was Adrian Carlyle, the Duke of Renmore, and he had been appointed to oversee the inquiry into the Aldous estate, because no one else of sufficient rank could be found who was not somehow connected to one of the parties. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, with dark hair going iron at the temples and a face that the season had long ago decided was cold. He rarely spoke at the assemblies he was obliged to attend. He never danced. Mothers had given up on him years before, and the gossip had settled into the comfortable shape of a man too proud to be reached. None of them knew the truth of it, and none of them would learn it that morning. What they saw was a duke at a window still as carved stone, and what they did not see was that his stillness had a direction, and the direction was the gray gown and the folded hands, and the woman the room had agreed not to look at. The inquiry had a simple cause and a complicated history. Old Sir Henry Aldous had died in the spring, and his will had done a strange thing. He had left the estate of Thornley not to his elder daughter Margaret, who had married well and lived in town, but to his younger daughter Honora, who had never married at all and who, the family insisted, was incapable of managing so much as a household account. Margaret had brought the matter before the commission, on the grounds that her sister was not of sound mind, that the will had been made under improper influence, and that the estate should pass to its natural and capable heir. Pyre, Kyre, Kyre. The natural and capable heir, in this telling, was Margaret herself, with her husband's cousin, Mr. Bramwell Foss, standing ready to administer the property until such time as the question of Honora's mind could be permanently settled. Honora had said nothing in her own defense. She had been given the chance in a smaller room on an earlier day, and she had only looked at the floor and folded her hands and let them write down what they liked. That was the report that had reached the commissioners. That was the report that had reached the room. What none of them knew was what the silence had cost her, and where it had come from, and that it was not the silence of an empty mind, but the silence of a woman who had learned, young and hard, that to be thought simple was the safest thing a girl could be in a house that punished cleverness in its daughters. She had been 7 when her mother died, and her father, grieving and bewildered, had handed his 2 girls to a succession of governesses and let the elder one rule the nursery. Margaret had been 10, already quick and already cruel in the small ways. Children are cruel when no one is watching. Honora had a gift that revealed itself early, a gift for languages, the way some children have a gift for music. She heard French and kept it. She heard Italian from a visiting tutor and gave it back the same afternoon. By 12 she read Latin better than the curate, and when a delegation of émigrés passed a winter at a neighbor's house, she came home speaking their particular Provençal as though she had been born to it. She remembered the precise afternoon the lesson took. She had been 9, and a French governess had set her a passage to construe. And Honora had not only construed it, but corrected an error in the older woman's own copy, gently, the way a child does who does not yet know that being right is dangerous. Margaret had been in the room. She had said nothing then. That night a small, painted fan that Honora loved, the only thing of her mother's she had been given, was found broken in the nursery grate, and Margaret had wept prettily to the governess about her clumsy little sister who broke things she could not understand, and the governess had believed her, because Margaret was the kind of child the world believed. Honora had not wept. She had looked at the broken sticks of the fan in the ash, and understood the arithmetic of her own life with a clarity that never afterward left her. A clever girl is a rival. A simple girl is a pet. A rival is broken in the grate. A pet is merely ignored. And being ignored, Honora had decided at 9 years old, was survivable in a way that being a rival was not. So she had chosen. She had let the French slide back behind her teeth. She had stopped correcting the curate. She had learned to fold her hands and lower her eyes, and let her sister shine in the front of every room, while she kept the back of the house and the company of the servants, who alone knew what she was, and who alone kept her secret across all the long years, because servants understand better than anyone. The choice had become a habit. The habit had become a cage. And the worst of it, the part she never said aloud in any of her 5 languages, was that she had built the cage so well she no longer remembered where the door had been. The Duke had read the file. He had read every page of it twice, and something in the account of the silent younger sister had refused to sit quietly in his understanding, because he had spent a great many years now perfecting a silence of his own, and he knew the difference between an empty room and a locked one. The first morning of the inquiry passed in tedious procedure. Margaret gave her account in a voice pitched for sympathy, dabbing at dry eyes, describing a childhood spent shielding her poor sister from a world too sharp for her. Foss confirmed every word with the eagerness of a man who had memorized his part. A physician was produced who had examined Honora for the space of a quarter hour and pronounced her understanding deficient. Through all of it, Honora sat apart and looked at her folded hands, and the room grew more certain of her with every passing minute, and the Duke at the window grew less certain by exactly the same degree. At the noon recess, he did a thing that surprised his own clerk. He sent word that the younger Miss Aldous was to be brought a chair nearer the table out of the draught, and that she was to be given tea. It was a small thing, a thing of no consequence, and he gave the order in the flat, level voice of a man arranging furniture. The clerk, a careful young man named Sefton, who had served the Duke 2 years and prided himself on anticipating his wants, hesitated for half a breath before he carried the order out, because in 2 years he had never once known the Duke to take notice of a single soul in a courtroom beyond the legal point they represented. When the footman set the cup beside her and Honora looked up, she found the Duke looking back, and for one unguarded instant something passed between them that had no name in any of the 5 languages she carried. She looked down again at once. Her hand reaching for the cup was not quite steady. She set it down without drinking. And the Duke, who missed nothing, saw the unsteady hand and understood it for what it was, which was not weakness, and filed it away with the other things he was beginning to know about her. Margaret saw the chair move. She saw the tea. She watched her sister brought out of the draught and into the warmth at the Duke's quiet word, and a small line appeared between her brows that had not been there a moment before. It was the first time in 3 days that the inquiry had done anything. She had not arranged, and she did not like the feeling, though she could not yet have said why. She leaned again to the woman beside her and murmured something behind her fan, and the woman laughed softly, and across the hall Honora heard neither the words nor the laugh, because she was occupied entirely with the warmth of a cup she had not asked for, and the strange fact of having been seen. That night, in the cold lodging the commission had taken in the town, Honora sat at a narrow window and did the thing she had done every night of her life that she could not bear. She translated. She took the day, the whole cruel, polished length of it, and she rendered it silently into French, and then into Italian, and then into the Latin of her father's library, as though putting the pain into other tongues might file down its edges. She had begun the practice as a child, alone in the nursery after the worst of Margaret's days, when she had discovered that a cruelty, spoken in English and then turned into French, became somehow a smaller thing, an object she could hold at arm's length and examine rather than a wound she had to wear. By the time she was grown, it had become as natural to her as breathing. It was the only freedom she had ever been permitted, and she had built whole rooms inside it where no one could follow. Tonight the room she built had a window in it, and at the window stood a tall man with iron at his temples, who had moved a chair out of the draught and looked at her as though she were a sentence worth recording, and she found that she could not translate him out of the day no matter which language she tried. He would not go small. He stayed exactly his own size in every tongue she owned. She did not weep. She had stopped weeping a long time ago. She translated her sister's voice until it stopped sounding like a voice at all, and then she sat a while longer with the one thing the day had given her that refused to be filed down, and then she slept. The second day brought the matter of the documents. The Aldous estate had dealings abroad, as many estates did, with interests in a shipping concern out of Marseille, and a long correspondence with agents in Genoa and Lisbon, and the bulk of this correspondence was, of course, in French and Italian and Portuguese. Mr. Foss had prepared translations. He laid them before the Commission with great confidence, and the Commission, none of whom read those languages with any fluency, accepted them as a matter of course. The translations told a tidy story. They showed the estate's foreign interest to be near worthless, heavily encumbered, a burden rather than a fortune, which conveniently supported Margaret's argument that the property needed firm and capable hands, and that Honora's inheritance was as much a misfortune as a prize. It was at this point on the second afternoon that the Duke spoke for the first time at any length. He asked, in his level way, whether the original letters might be entered alongside the translations. Mr. Pasteur Foss said that this was hardly necessary, that the translations had been prepared by a reputable man in town. The Duke said that he would see the originals regardless. There was a pause, a small disturbance in the room's confidence, and the originals were sent for. He observed her then. He had positioned himself, without seeming to, where he could watch Honora's face while the foreign letters were read aloud in their own tongues for the record, and he saw what he had suspected he might see. As the clerk stumbled through the French, Honora's lips moved the smallest fraction, shaping the correct words a half-beat ahead of the man reading them. When the clerk mispronounced a Genoese place name, something crossed her face that was unmistakably a wince. She caught herself. She stilled. Yet the Duke had seen it, and his certainty, which had been growing for 2 days, became something settled and quiet and immovable. He did not expose her then. That was the thing the room would later find most difficult to understand, and the thing Honora herself would turn over for a long time afterward. He had her. He had the proof of her mind in the movement of her own mouth, and he could have called it out and ended the matter in an afternoon. He did not. Instead, he adjourned the inquiry until the following week, citing the need to verify the documents. And in the days between, he did something no one expected a Duke to do. He came to Thornley. He came alone, on horseback, in the soft gold light of an October afternoon, and he found her not in the house but in the kitchen garden, where she had gone to escape the lawyers and the relatives, kneeling in the dirt among the late herbs, with her sleeves pushed up and her plain gown smeared at the knee. She did not hear him at first. She was speaking to the old gardener, a half-deaf Breton named Jan, who had served the family 30 years, and whom no one else at Thornley could understand, and she was speaking to him in his own Breton, low and easy and laughing, helping him decide which beds to clear before the frost. There was a basket between them half full of cut rosemary and sage, and as the Duke watched, she reached across and steadied the old man's hand on the shears where it had begun to shake, and finished the cut for him, and said something that made the gardener throw back his head and laugh a long, wheezing laugh at the autumn sky. The Duke stood at the gate and watched a woman the world had called empty conduct, a warm and fluent conversation in a language perhaps 4 people in the county possessed, and he understood that he was watching her actual life, the one she lived when she believed no one of consequence was looking. This was the woman Sir Henry had trusted with Thornley. The Duke saw it now with perfect clarity. Not a simpleton to be protected and managed, but a woman who steadied an old man's shaking hands and finished his work for him and kept his dignity intact in the only tongue he had left, and who did it freely for no reward, when she believed herself unobserved. A man did not need a physician's report to know which of the two sisters could be trusted with the care of a difficult and tangled inheritance. He needed only to stand at a garden gate for the space of 3 minutes. When she finally saw him, she went white, and then very still, and the laughter died out of her face. And she rose and brushed the dirt from her hands and arranged herself back into the shape the world expected. The downcast eyes, the folded hands, the silence. It was like watching someone close a door. He found that he could not bear it. "You need not do that with me," he said. The words came out lower than he intended. She did not answer. She did not look at the floor either, and that was something. He let himself in through the gate, which a duke had no business doing unannounced at another family's house, and he did not seem to care. He crossed to where she stood and looked for a moment at the basket of cut herbs, and the old gardener now watching them both with sharp, half-deaf interest, and then he turned his attention fully to her in a way she was entirely unused to, and did not know how to withstand. "You will catch cold out here," he said. "Sit. There is a bench by the wall." It was a command, level and quiet, and she found her body obeying it before her mind had agreed to anything, which was itself a thing she would have to think about later. She sat on the low stone bench in the last of the afternoon light, and he sat at the other end of it. A proper and careful distance between them, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. He stayed an hour. He asked her nothing about the inquiry. He asked her instead about the garden, about the Breton, about the émigrés who had wintered nearby when she was a girl. And slowly, the way one coaxes a wild thing to take food from an open hand, he drew her into speech. She answered in single, careful sentences. At first, then in longer ones. And at last, when he made some small error in his own schoolboy French, she corrected him without thinking, sharply and precisely, the way she would have corrected the curate 20 years before. The correction hung in the air between them. She froze, appalled at herself. And the Duke, for the first time in longer than he could remember, very nearly smiled. What had been done to her, he asked at last, that she had buried a mind like that so deep? She was quiet for a long while. Then she told him, not all of it, but enough. She told him that in her house, a clever girl was a danger and a simple girl was safe, that her sister had taught her this lesson with great thoroughness across a great many years, and that somewhere along the way, the safety had become the only thing she knew how to be. She did not say it for pity. She said it the way a person reads out an inventory, flat and exact, and that flatness told him more than tears would have. He understood it better than she could have known, because he had done the same thing himself, only with the opposite face. Where she had hidden her brilliance behind silence, he had hidden his grief behind cold. The two of them sat in the late garden light, two people who had each built a cage and called it safety, and recognized each other across the distance. His own cage had a name and a date, and a small portrait he carried in his breast pocket that he had shown to no living person in 6 years. Her name had been Cecily. She had been his wife for not quite 2 years, gentle and bright and badly suited to the hard winters of the North Country, and she had died of a fever. He had been too far away to nurse her through, in a house he had left her alone in while he attended to business. He had told himself could not wait. He remembered the letter that had reached him 3 days too late, carried by a rider who had killed 2 horses to bring it, and he remembered that he had been sitting at another man's dinner table, arguing a point of drainage law when she had drawn her last breath 60 miles away, with only the servants around her. He had told himself a great many things in the year since. None of them had ever quite worked. He had decided in the cold, clear way he decided things that he had failed the one person who had needed him, and that the safest course thereafter was to need no one and be needed by none. And he had been so successful at this that the entire kingdom believed him incapable of feeling. He let them believe it. It was easier than the truth. which was that the feeling had never gone anywhere at all, but had only been packed away in a breast pocket like a portrait and carried everywhere, and shown to no one. He did not tell Honora all of this in the garden. He told her almost none of it. He found, riding back through the dark to the town, that he wanted to, and the wanting frightened him more than anything had in years, because a man who has built a fortress around a single locked room learns to be afraid of any voice that makes him want to open it. He had thought the door welded shut. He discovered on the cold road home that it was merely closed, and that a woman kneeling in a kitchen garden speaking Breton to an old man had set her hand to it without even knowing the door was there. The week passed. The inquiry resumed. And Margaret, who had begun to sense that something at the heart of the matter had shifted in a direction she did not like, decided to settle the question of her sister permanently before the Duke could finish whatever he had begun. She came to the second session with a new instrument. She had drawn up a deed of guardianship, a document that would place Honora and the entire estate under Mr. Perry. Foss's legal control on the grounds of incapacity, and she had arranged, through her husband's connections, for it to be presented to the Commission as a humane resolution that would spare the poor woman the ordeal of further questioning. It wanted only the Commission's endorsement, and Honora's mark, which any two witnesses could swear she had been guided to make. It was, the Duke saw at once, an attempt to win the entire matter, without ever letting Honora speak. And he saw too that it might well succeed, because the room still believed what it had believed on the first morning, and a room that has decided a thing is the hardest thing in the world to move. The dark moment came on the third day in the same crowded hall, under the same wide windows. Margaret rose and made her plea with real feeling, and it was the feeling that made it dangerous, because half of it was sincere. She did believe, in the part of herself that had never examined itself, that her sister was less than she was. She had needed to believe it for so long that the belief had become true to her. She turned to the commissioners, and she said the words for the second time, in the most public setting she could have chosen, before the whole assembled county. "My sister," she said, "is a simple creature who has never in her life spoken a sentence worth recording. Let us be kind to her. Let us spare her this." The room murmured its agreement. The physician nodded. Mr. Pre. Foss laid the deed upon the table and uncapped the ink. A footman was sent to bring Honora forward to make her mark. And Honora rose from her chair apart and walked the length of the hall to the table, and the room watched her come the way it would watch a child led to a difficult chore, with patience and pity, and not one scrap of expectation. She reached the table. The pen was held out to her, and she looked for one moment at the Duke, who had said nothing, who could have said everything, and who was watching her now with an expression that asked her a single silent question. It was not a command. He had given her commands before, small protective ones. Sit, drink this, stay out of the draft, and she had read them all correctly, in the end. This was not one of those. This was a man stepping back to leave a door open and waiting, with his heart in his throat, to see whether she would walk through it on her own. He would not do it for her. He understood, better than anyone in the room, that a freedom handed to her would only be another cage, with a kinder keeper, and that the one thing he could give her that mattered was the room to free herself. Honora set down the pen. She turned to the commissioners, and in a voice that no one in that hall had ever heard her use, clear and level and entirely her own, she addressed them in English, first asking their leave to speak to the documents that had been entered concerning the estate's foreign affairs. The chief commissioner, too startled to refuse, granted it. What followed took the better part of an hour. The county would speak of it for the rest of the century. Honora took up the original French letters and read them aloud in French, her voice steady and unhurried, then translated them accurately into English and showed line by line where Mr. Foss's prepared translations had reversed their meaning, turning solvent ventures into ruined ones and profits into debts. She did not raise her voice once. She did not need to. She laid each letter and its false translation side by side on the table, and read them against each other so plainly that even the commissioners who knew no French could follow the deception by the simple arithmetic of the figures that did not match. She took up the Italian correspondence from Genoa and did the same, exposing a sum of £3,000 that had been moved from one column to another to make a thriving interest look like a sinking one. She read the Portuguese from Lisbon. She read a passage of Latin from her father's own hand, a codicil of explanation that Foss's people had declared illegible, and rendered it into English so that the room could hear, in Sir Henry's own words, Cunden exactly why he had left Thornley to the daughter. He trusted with its tangled foreign affairs, rather than the daughter who had married into a household that would have sold them off in a season. Mr. Foss rose once to object, his face the color of tallow, and said that the woman could not possibly be doing what she appeared to be doing, that it was some trick of memory, some passage learned by rote and recited. Honora turned to him. She asked him in French to select any letter from the pile at random and hand it to her unseen by her beforehand. He did not move. She asked him again, in Italian. The room understood, even those who spoke neither tongue, that a woman reciting from memory cannot translate a letter she has never been allowed to choose, and that the man who would not hand her one had just answered the question more completely than any words of hers could have. Foss sat down. He did not rise again. And then, because one of the Genoese agents had sent an observer to the inquiry, a small dark man who had sat unnoticed at the back for 3 days, she turned and addressed him directly in his own Ligurian dialect and asked him to confirm to the commission whether her account of the correspondence was accurate. He rose, astonished, and confirmed it in halting English, and added, looking around the hall with frank bewilderment, that he had assumed for 3 days that the silent lady at the side was a person of no importance, and that he wished to apologize, for he had plainly been mistaken. 5 languages, in open court, each one a nail driven through the story the room had built. The silence when she finished was total. The Duke crossed the room. He did not hurry. He came to stand beside her at the table, in full view of the commissioners and the county, and her white-faced sister, and he spoke into that silence the only thing the moment required. I will marry Miss Aldous myself. He said no more than that. He did not denounce Margaret. He did not gloat. He let the 7 words sit in the hall and do their work, and their work was complete, because a duke's stated intention to marry a woman is a verdict against which no deed of incapacity can stand, and every soul in the room understood it at once. The deed on the table was so much waste paper now. The woman the county had agreed to pity could not be made a ward of anyone, because she was to be the Duchess of Renmore, and a duchess is not simple. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a word. The fan in her hand stopped its motion, and then began again, too fast, the only part of her composure that survived. She looked at her sister as though seeing her for the first time, which, in every way that mattered, she was. The physician was suddenly very interested in his papers. Mr. Foss capped his ink with a hand that shook, and at the back of the hall a quiet thing happened that only a few people noticed. The old housekeeper from Thornley, Mrs. Preble, Pell, who had known Honora since she was 7 and had spent 30 years pretending along with everyone else, put her apron to her face and wept with what was unmistakably relief, as though she had been holding her breath for 2 decades and could finally let it go. The commission found for Honora on every point. The translations were thrown out, the deed was struck. Sir Henry's will stood exactly as he had written it, and the procedural matters were sealed that same week by the senior commissioner so that no later challenge could undo them. Margaret returned to town a great deal quieter than she had come. She was not destroyed. She was not made to suffer beyond the loss of a thing she had never truly owned. She was simply, finally, wrong in front of everyone, and made to live with it, which for a woman built entirely of being right, was punishment enough. The law, however, was only the smaller half of what had been settled in that hall, and Honora knew it, and so did the man who had crossed the room. They were married quietly at Renmore before the first snow. There was no crowd, which suited them both, only a handful of people who had earned their places. Jan the gardener came north for it, complaining about the cold and fluent Breton the whole way, and stood at the back of the small stone chapel in a coat the Duke had quietly had made for him, and wept without any embarrassment at all when the vows were spoken, though he understood not one word of the English they were spoken in. Mrs. Pell came and cried again, more happily this time, and fussed over Honora's gown, a simple thing of warm cream that the new Duchess had chosen herself, and would let no one talk her out of. The senior commissioner stood as a witness, pleased to be part of a tidy ending, and pleased, too, to have his seal on a matter that would now never be reopened. On the morning of the wedding, before the others arrived, Adrian did a thing he had not done in 6 years. He took the small portrait from his breast pocket, the one of Cecily, and he held it in his hand a long moment. And then he showed it to Honora, and he told her the whole of it. The fever, and the distance, and the long cold penance he had made of his life. He told her about the rider who had killed 2 horses, and the dinner table 60 miles away, and the letter that came 3 days too late, and the years afterward in which he had taught the entire world that he could not be reached. His voice did not break. He had carried the words too long for that. He simply set them down, one after another, in the quiet of the room, the way she had once set down the inventory of her own childhood in a kitchen garden. He did not show it to her as a confession he needed forgiven. He showed it to her because she had spent her whole life being known by no one, and he had decided she would never again live with a man who kept a locked room she was not permitted to enter. When he had finished, Honora took the portrait gently from his hand, and looked at the gentle, bright face of the woman who had come before her, and she said, in English, that Cecily had been loved by a good man, and that this was no small thing to have been. Then she gave it back to him, and he returned it to his pocket, where it would stay. No longer a wound he hid, but simply a part of the man she had chosen. The coda of their first winter together has only one image worth keeping, and it is this. Thornley, which Honora had refused to sell and would not abandon, kept its kitchen garden, and Jan kept tending it. And on a gray afternoon late in that first married winter, the Duke came looking for his wife, and found her exactly where he had first truly seen her, out among the frost-bitten beds, sleeves pushed up despite the cold, kneeling in the dirt and laughing in Breton, with an old half-deaf gardener about which beds would come back in spring. She did not go still when she saw him this time. She did not close the door. She looked up, and she smiled, and she went on with her conversation, and she let him stand at the gate and listen to a language he would never fully learn, spoken freely by a woman the world had once decided could not speak at all. Snow had begun to fall, very lightly, settling on her hair and on the dark shoulders of his coat, and neither of them moved to go in. There was no hurry now. There was a whole life for it. If Honora's afternoon in that crowded hall stayed with you, stay a moment longer in the quiet of it, and carry it out into your own day. Thank you for staying until the very end.